the wrong kind of story must be marginalized and kept from the eyes of the public. And meanwhile, we focus on the terrible crimes of others, like Charles Taylor in Sierra Leone. I mean, it's pretty obvious why they wanted to cut Gaddafi out. He was a loyal friend and ally, so you don't want to implicate him. Well, now the story's changed, so we talk about what we can do about this monster. That's, again, perfectly normal. To take just one last case, in the 1970s, Saddam Hussein was an enemy. That changed in the early 80s. In fact, in 1982, the Reagan administration decided that they wanted to provide arms to Iraq, to assist in their invasion of Iran. Well, there's a little impediment. There's an institution called the List of Terrorist States, and Iraq was on the list of terrorist states. So the government had to remove Saddam from the list of terrorist states, and since there was a gap, they had to put somebody in, so they put Cuba in honor of the fact that Cuba had been the victim of really massive terrorism in the preceding several years, shooting down an airliner, killing 75 people, blowing up embassies, all sorts of crimes. So they were put in on the terrorist list to replace Saddam, who came out. The next year, 1983, we had Donald Rumsfeld going to Baghdad, shaking hands with his friend Saddam, entering into arms and other deals. This continued right through the 1980s. U.S. support for Iraq was so strong that Iraq was given a kind of a gift that no other country has except Israel. They were permitted to attack a U.S. ship and kill a couple of dozen sailors and get away with it nothing but a weak apology. Nobody can do that except for Israel, which did it in 1967. But that shows real love. The U.S. essentially entered the war. The U.S. also denied Saddam's atrocities. That's the Halabja massacre, the Al-Anfal massacres that occurred, everything denied. In fact, the administration even intervened in Congress to prevent them from issuing a declaration of censure for these huge atrocities, the worst ones of Saddam's rule. And finally, the U.S. entered the war directly, and Iran capitulated. They couldn't face U.S. participation in the war. Love for Saddam continued after the war. In 1989, so that's a year after the war ended, the president was now President Bush, the first President Bush. He invited Iraqi nuclear engineers to the United States for advanced weapons training in nuclear weapons manufacture. That's 1989. A couple of months after that, President Bush sent a delegation to Iraq to convey his greetings to his friend Saddam. This was April 1990. The delegation was led by Senator Robert Dole. He was Senate Majority Leader, later Republican presidential candidate, other high-level senators. We have the transcript. They brought President Bush's greetings to Saddam. They assured Saddam that he could ignore some critical comment he was hearing in the American press, that we have this freedom of press business, so we can't figure out a way to shut them up, but you can ignore them. And in fact, the White House assured Saddam that they would remove from the Voice of America, the official international press service, eliminate a reporter who was being too critical of their friend. This was April 1990. A couple of months later, Saddam committed a real crime. He disobeyed orders, or maybe misunderstood them. It's not clear. And he invaded Kuwait. Okay, he suddenly became the reincarnation of Hitler. Saddam realized when he invaded Kuwait that he'd made a mistake, that he thought it could be authorized. He didn't understand. He saw right away he's in trouble. And then the discourse in the White House is interesting, which we also have. In the White House, they were concerned. Colin Powell, head of the Joint Chiefs, said the problem is that Saddam might withdraw and leave a puppet regime behind, and all the Arab states would be perfectly happy. And we can't allow that to happen, so we have to go to war and destroy Iraq. Well, if Saddam had been allowed to do that, he would have duplicated almost exactly what the U.S. had done a couple of months earlier, namely invaded Panama in order to kidnap a thug who had also disobeyed orders, brought him to Florida where he was tried for crimes that he committed while he was on the CIA payroll, installed a puppet government. About the only difference is the Latin American states weren't happy about it. They threw Panama out of the coalition of democratic states and so on. The deaths were also a little different. According to Human Rights Watch, tried to estimate it, when Saddam invaded Kuwait, there were about 800 people killed. According to Panamanian human rights groups, when the U.S. invaded Panama, there were about 3,000 killed. Now, we don't look at casualties that we cause. That's another thing that's off the record. So there's no Western confirmation of these calculations, but they could very well be right. American forces were bombing apartment houses and poor neighborhoods and so on. Well, that's not exactly the story the way it reaches us. It's only the story the way it happened all the way through. And that's, again, quite typical. It's like not mentioning the slightly embarrassing fact that the International Criminal Court absolved Gaddafi of the atrocities for which they just condemned Taylor, because he was a friend and an ally like Saddam Hussein. This story just proliferates so far that it's almost pointless to give examples. It's hard to think of an exception. It's close to uniform. And that tells you something very significant about the role of intellectuals and their responsibility in the service of power, both in supporting atrocities and crimes and in reshaping the current scene and history so that it looks good for us, for the powerful. This may be against the will of the public, as in the case of Vietnam, but it ends up being the picture that's transmitted to later generations. So it's what you'll read in school and so on. I said that the Dreyfusards were that's when the term intellectual came into common use. There were intellectuals before the Dreyfusards. They weren't called that. They were called something else. And it goes back to the origins of recorded history. So you go back to, say, classical Greece. There was a man who was made to drink the hemlock, the death sentence, because he committed a crime. He was corrupting the youth of Athens by challenging false gods. And that's a crime, so get rid of him. He was a dissident and treated the way dissidents are treated. Roughly the same time, from the biblical records, we discover that there were dissidents. Again, they weren't called that. They weren't called intellectuals. They were called prophets. That's a bad translation of a very obscure Hebrew word. Nobody knows what it means. But they were called prophets. But if you look back if you read the Bible, what they were was what we would call dissident intellectuals. They were carrying out geopolitical analysis, warning that the kings were, carrying out actions like alienating the Assyrians and so on, which were going to cause disaster. They were calling for mercy and justice to widows and orphans. They were condemning the crimes of the evil king and so on. Were they treated nicely? Well, go back to the Bible and take a look. They were called haters of Israel. That's the origin of the phrase self-hating Jew, which you hear all the time. It extends to anti-American, meaning critics of your own country. And they were driven into the desert, imprisoned, not treated nicely at all. There were intellectuals who were treated very well and honored. They were also called prophets. Centuries later, they were called false prophets. But they were the flatterers at the court, and they were doing fine. And that's the way it works. Flatterers at the court are honored and respected. The critics are punished one way or another. How they're punished depends on the society, but always treated badly in one way or another. It can be at the extreme. It can be like the assassinated Jesuits. Lesser punishment could be, say, Havel and Sakharov, and similarly all the way back. This is a very persistent theme in history. You can think it through and see if you can find counterexamples. Actually, there are a few counterexamples, and they're very striking. So today, in today's world, the only really significant counterexamples that I know of, at least, are in Turkey. In Turkey, leading intellectuals, the prominent writers, the most prominent writers, academics, journalists, publishers, and artists, not only are protesting constantly the crimes of the Turkish state, which are pretty serious, not only protesting those crimes, but constantly participating in civil disobedience against them, which means facing, sometimes enduring, really severe punishment, like long jail sentences. I don't know of any other country like this. And I have to say, when I come to Europe, I always have to smile a little when I hear that the Turks are not civilized enough to be allowed into the august European Union. I mean, maybe, but from another point of view, it looks a little bit different. But that's the only major exception that I know today. So there are exceptions, undoubtedly. Well, that's one interpretation of the responsibility of intellectuals. What's the general task that they fulfill, the factual side? There's also the value issue. There you have to, factual side, you can study the facts and draw pretty conclusions with fair confidence. When you turn to the values, of course, you're asking what your own moral values are. And I think there are a number of pretty simple ideas that ought to define what the role of intellectuals ought to be. By intellectuals, I just mean people of relative privilege, training, resources, opportunity, an ability to be in a position where you can get involved in some fashion in affairs that matter to human beings. So it's intellectuals. It excludes, for example, a great scientist who just stays in his laboratory and wins his Nobel Prize. It excludes somebody who's working so hard putting food on the table that he just doesn't have time to think about these things. But it includes, in our societies like ours, a large group of other people. For example, anybody related to a university anyhow, because we have these privileges and opportunities. So that's roughly the category. One principle that you'd think would be obvious is that we apply to ourselves the same standards we apply to others, or maybe harsher ones, more stringent ones, but at least the same ones. So if terror is bad when they do it to us, then terror is bad when we do it to them, maybe 10 times as much. And that's, again, to take a historical example, if anyone were to follow this principle, take, say, 9/11, the great modern event that changed the world, transformed the world. It was a terrible atrocity, undoubtedly. Could have been a lot worse. Very much like Havel's punishment, could have been worse. So suppose on 9/11 that Al-Qaeda had, say, bombed the White House, killed the president, installed a military dictatorship. murdered thousands of people, tortured tens of thousands of people, established an international terror center in Washington, which started overthrowing governments in other countries and installing comparable dictatorships, carrying out assassinations abroad and so on. Brought in a group of economists, maybe call them the Kandahar boys, who quickly tanked the economy, drove it into the worst depression it had been in maybe in its entire history. Okay, that would have been worse. It happened on 9/11. It happened on 9/11, 1973. It's the overthrow of the Allende government in Chile and the installation of the Pinochet dictatorship. Well, it was a lot worse than, in fact, in Latin America, they often call it the first 9/11. It was incomparably worse than what we call 9/11 by any dimension you can think of. But that one, and it certainly changed the world. It was instrumental in causing the rash of dictatorships that spread over Latin America and much else. Not to speak of what it did to the people of Chile, but that's not in history. If we were to accept the elementary principle that the usual defect, wrong agency, U.S. was behind it, if we were to accept the principle that we apply to ourselves the same standards we do to others, that's the way we'd be discussing and teaching and thinking about the atrocities of 9/11. Well, needless to say, it's not, though it is in parts of South America. The victims tend to have a somewhat more realistic view of the world than the ones who hold the clubs. So one principle is at least apply to yourselves the same standards you do to apply to others. That sounds simple, but almost never observed. Another is to set priorities. We all have finite energy and time, can't do everything. So try to focus on the things that are important. What are importance, of course, is another value judgment. So what's important? Well, one criterion for importance is things that you can influence. So if there's something going on somewhere where you can have an influence, well, that's important to focus on. It may be nice to criticize the crimes of Genghis Khan, but you can't do much about it. And the same is true of crimes carried out by somebody else. You can say how awful it is, but nothing much you can do. On the other hand, crimes in which you're involved yourselves, you can do quite a lot. The closer you are to agency, the more you can do. So that should be the focus. Well, I won't run through examples. I leave it as an exercise. But you'll find that exactly the opposite is done. Exactly the opposite. In fact, you can pretty well determine what the role of intellectuals ought to be by taking a look at what is going on and just turning it to the opposite. It turns out to be a pretty successful technique of analysis. So that's another thing you can do. Other things you can do are to participate in changing your own surroundings, as much of the society as you can reach, in such ways that these values will be accepted, whether it's by teaching, by organizing, by activism, many other ways. I just end by citing an injunction which often is used to formulate these principles, which I think merits some critical attention. It's a precept used by people who personally are close friends and who I respect and honor a lot, Quaker activists, Quaker human rights, anti-war activists, very courageous people, also involved in civil disobedience, protests, very dedicated, picking the right principles. Their precept is that they should be telling truth to power. And I think that's the one thing I really disagree with them on. I don't think that the role of people with some degree of privilege, say like us, should be to tell truth to power. One reason is power already knows the truth. You don't have to tell it to them. They understand it very well. That's why they're doing what they're doing. Another is that they're not the right audience. You should be reaching people who don't know the truth. Tell them. Furthermore, you shouldn't be telling them. It's not that we have some, I, you, whoever it is, has some kind of magic authority. We have our own ideas. They have their ideas. In 1975, for example, the large majority of Americans, I think, knew the truth, that the war was not a mistake. It was fundamentally wrong and immoral. You don't have to tell them the truth. You can participate with them in finding out the truth, learning it yourself, encouraging them to think it through for themselves. So you should be reaching out to other people, trying to learn the truth as best you can together with them, and it should be the audience that matters, not the powerful, and it should be on issues that are of significance. So I think a somewhat more complex version of that precept ought to be adopted. But the intuition behind it is right, and I think it's a sensible guide. And from that we can kind of work out what the responsibility of intellectuals ought to be, comparing it with what the function actually is, and drawing appropriate conclusions. I'll stop there.
How can we be heard so long as we're nobody yet? Unknown, economically dependent, and supposed to get somewhere.
Is this working? Yeah. Well, first of all, nobody is nobody. And if you want to have, there are very good models as to what young people can do. They've achieved a great deal. So let's go back, say, 50 years and go to North Carolina in the United States, or Georgia in the United States. At that point, young people who were facing far harsher difficulties than you are, young black kids, decided to sit in on restaurants, to insist on being waited in restaurants, which was illegal for blacks at the time. So a small group of young kids, college students, went and sat in at a bar in a diner. The police came, took them out, threw them in jail. I'm sure it wasn't very pleasant. The next day, more came back and did it again. After a couple of years, it ended up really revolutionizing the country. That's one of the things that sparked the civil rights movement. They were at a lot of them were at Spelman College, a black college. They had virtually no support from the faculty. 2 faculty members supported them. Both were thrown out. One was Howard Zinn, who you may know, my old friend who died 2 years ago. He was a faculty member. He supported the students. He was expelled. The students themselves went on. A lot of them joined the group that became the Freedom Riders. At that point, some white students from the North came down to join them. And they rode in buses through the South trying to register blacks that couldn't register then. It wasn't easy. Several of them got murdered. Others were beaten, thrown into prisons. I was down there for demonstrations, and you could see, watching while state police were beating people, young kids mostly, driving them up they were fleeing to the steps of the federal building where the state police are not allowed to go. And the federal building was lined with federal marshals sent from Washington who were throwing them back into the streets. That's the way the government was protecting them. They achieved a great deal. Martin Luther King, who was an extremely important person, would have been the first to tell you that he was riding the groundswell that they developed. And that's by no means the only case. Take my own university, MIT. MIT was practically 100% funded by the Pentagon, which, contrary to what a lot of people believe, means it was extremely free. The Pentagon didn't care what you did. They wanted to create the economy of the future. That was their job. It's highly undemocratic. They were using public resources not they, the government, used public resources on the pretext of defense to develop computers, the internet, microelectronics, and so on. That's the way the high-tech economy developed. But it was a very passive place, very passive, acquiescent, people doing their work, not paying much attention to anything. There were about 5 students who decided to try to stir the place up. Some of them you may know. One was Michael Albert, who now runs ZNet. Another was Steve Shalom, who's Pete Boehmer, a couple others. And they just kind of began organizing groups around the campus. By 1968, they had so radicalized the campus that Mike Albert was elected student president on a platform so radical you can barely believe it. Well, he was thrown out. We had to get him back in. And usual things happened. But the point is that the university's never been the same to this day. Now it's active, a lot of participation, totally different relationships among people, and it's a center of activism. And things like that happen all the time. There's a tremendous amount that young people can do. In fact, if you look at take, say, Tahrir Square in Cairo, that was mostly organized by fairly young people, I guess in their 20s mostly, tech savvy, began reaching out to others. They didn't really expect much at the beginning, but within a couple of weeks, they had half of Egypt out there. And they overthrew a dictatorship. They got a long way to go, but it was a major event, again, initiated by young people who were committed and active. And there are plenty of other examples. You can be heard, all right.
In linguistics, you have wondered whether language is an optimal solution. Mm-hmm. Do you think there is an optimal solution in politics as well? Or should we sometimes accept the least bad option?
Well, if there is an optimal solution, I'm not smart enough to figure out what it is. There's just too much we don't know about human beings and about societies. A lot would have to be learned by experimentation, trying things, see if they work, try other things, and so on. And in fact, this is a pretty traditional view on the left. So say, take Karl Marx. You read through all of his works, you find practically nothing on post-capitalist society. A couple of sentences scattered around here and there. So in a post-capitalist society, everyone would fish in the morning and grow his garden in the afternoon, a couple of lines like that. And there was a reason for it. He believed in workers' democracy. His conception was that there would be a popular revolution, working people would take control of their own fate and their own institutions, and then they would work out what the society ought to be like. He didn't have a prescription. He had some ideas about general principles, but not a description. On the other hand, there were people on the left, still are, Mike Albert, who I mentioned, is one, who think that you can give a very detailed account of what a future society ought to be like. And they've worked out, detailed proposals, which you could try out right now, even within the present society. Well, between these two extremes, there are lots of approaches that people have taken, and you have to decide how much you think you understand. I don't think I understand very much, so I don't feel I'm more on Marx's side. I think these things will have to be worked out. I doubt that there's anything that you could call an optimal solution. That people are just too different. They live in too many different ways.